Okay, so get this right. We're diving into a law older than the U.S. itself, but it's still in the books. It could actually be used today.
Wow.
Yeah, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798.
Okay.
And we've got a whole bunch of stuff to unpack here. We've got original legal documents. We've got Wikipedia for context, some think tank analysis from the Brennan Center for Justice, news articles about how this law is making headlines, like right now, and even some spicy opinions from Reddit.
Well, it's really remarkable, a law crafted in the earliest days of the Republic can still spark debate and even fear in the 21st century.
I know, right. It's like a time capsule suddenly bursting open. Our mission today, what we're trying to do is figure out how this act works, how it's been used in the past, and what it could mean for us now. In a world that's arguably way more complicated than when it was first written. Like back then, there was no internet.
No internet.
No social media.
Yeah.
No global terrorism.
Exactly. It's a very different landscape. So let's start, I think, by dissecting the Alien Enemies Act itself.
Okay.
The core provisions, as laid out in 50 U.S.C. Chapter 3, it gives the president a lot of power. But during times of war, and we're talking declared wars or actual invasions.
So not just any old conflict.
Right.
It has to be a serious situation.
Exactly. The act allows the president to apprehend, restrain, or even remove non-naturalized individuals over the age of 14 who are from a hostile nation.
Okay.
So it's important to note what non-naturalized means. This is anyone who's not a full-fledged citizen of the U.S.
Okay. So like green card holders.
Yes.
Visa holders. Folks who are here legally but haven't become citizens. They could potentially be affected.
That's right. It's a broad category that could encompass a lot of people, and the age limit being 14 is striking. That would include teenagers.
Wow, that's pretty unsettling to think about.
It is. Now, the act does have, some safeguards built in.
Okay.
It allows for those who aren't deemed hostile to have time to sort out their affairs and leave the country voluntarily.
Okay.
Plus, U.S. courts can examine individual cases and potentially decide to remove, restrain, or require something called sureties from people considered a danger to public peace.
Sureties.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds like legalese.
Yeah, it is.
Can you break that down?
Sure. Essentially, it's like a guarantee of good behavior, often backed up with money.
Okay.
Think of it as a kind of legal insurance policy to ensure someone doesn't skip town or cause trouble.
Okay. Gotcha. And who would actually carry out these removals?
The act gives that responsibility to U.S. Marshals.
Okay.
So, there's a clear chain of command. There's a formal process involved.
It all sounds very official, very by the book.
Yeah.
But, the Wikipedia entry on the Alien and Sedition Acts, this kind of paints a picture of the political drama that surrounded these laws back in the 1790s. It was a big deal.
It was, yes. This was during the heated rivalry between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans.
Right.
The two dominant political parties at the time.
Right. And the Sedition Act, which was passed alongside the Alien Enemies Act, was specifically used to target journalists who criticized the government, right?
That's right. And what's particularly troubling is that only journalists aligned with the Democratic Republicans were targeted. Is a blatant attempt to silence dissenting voices and consolidate power.
Which makes you wonder if the Alien Enemies Act could also be used as a political weapon, not just a tool for wartime security.
Right. That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And it speaks to these anxieties surrounding federal power that were present even in the early days of the Republic.
Yeah, and I came across this quote from Thomas Jefferson where he calls the Alien Enemies Act a most detestable thing, worthy of the 8th or 9th century.
Wow.
So he was clearly not a fan.
He was not a fan, no. Jefferson viewed the act as a dangerous overreach of federal authority, a threat to individual liberty and freedom of speech. Remember, Jefferson was a staunch advocate for states' rights and limited government.
So it's not just about the specific provisions of the act.
No.
It's about the broader principles it represents.
Exactly.
The balance of power, the role of the federal government, the protection of individual rights.
Exactly. And while the Sedition Act eventually expired,
Right.
the Alien Enemies Act has remained on the books.
Oh, wow.
Lurking in the shadows of American law.
And it hasn't just been sitting there gathering dust, right?
Yeah.
It's actually been used in later conflicts.
Yes, it was invoked during the War of 1812. And then again in both World Wars.
Oh, wow.
In fact, during World War II, it played kind of a chilling role in the internment of Japanese, German, and Italian immigrants.
Wow, so this seemingly ancient law has a pretty dark history. Makes you wonder if something like the Japanese internment could happen again.
It's a question we can't afford to ignore. And it leads us directly into how this law is suddenly making headlines in the 21st century. The Brennan Center for Justice, a respected legal think tank, has issued some serious warnings about how the Alien Enemies Act could be misused today.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting and a bit scary.
Yeah.
Because we're not talking about hypothetical scenarios anymore. We're talking about real-world concerns that are playing out right now.
That's right. And to fully grasp the potential implications, we need to understand not only the letter of the law, but also how it could be interpreted and applied in our current political climate.
So let's unpack those modern-day concerns.
Yeah.
What exactly is the Brennan Center worried about?
Sure. Well, their analysis focuses on a recent development that has sent shockwaves through the legal community.
Yeah.
In 2024, former President Trump expressed his intention to invoke the Alien Enemies Act for a very specific purpose: the expedited removal of non-citizens he deemed involved in gangs and criminal networks.
Whoa. So using a wartime law to address a domestic issue,
Yeah.
that seems like a huge stretch.
It is. And the Brennan Center is very clear in its assessment. This would be a blatant misapplication of the act. Remember, the act is designed for times of declared war or invasion,
Right.
not for dealing with everyday law enforcement challenges.
Right. It's like using a bazooka to swat a fly.
Exactly.
It seems totally disproportionate.
It is. And that's why the Brennan Center's warning is so significant. They're essentially saying that this move could set a dangerous precedent, potentially eroding the very foundations of due process and fair treatment under the law.
And to make matters even more concerning, Trump also proposed something called Operation Aurora. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Operation Aurora was a proposal to use the U.S. military domestically for immigration enforcement.
Okay.
It involved deploying troops to the border and potentially even into cities to round up and deport undocumented immigrants.
Well, that sounds like something out of a dystopian novel.
It does, doesn't it? And when you combine that proposal with the intention to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, you start to see a very disturbing pattern emerging.
Yeah, it's like all the alarm bells are going off at once. So what does this mean for us? Like, could something like the Japanese internment actually happen again?
Well, it's a chilling thought, but we have to take it seriously. To understand the potential risks, we need to look not only at the act itself, but also at how the courts have interpreted it in the past and how the current Supreme Court might rule on such a case.
Okay, so this is where things get even more complex.
Yeah.
We're talking about legal precedents, judicial interpretations, and the balance of power between the different branches of government. This is next level stuff.
It is. But don't worry, we'll break it all down step by step.
I can't wait. I'm already feeling like I'm learning so much.
Good.
And I bet our listeners are too.
I'm sure they are. This is a topic that touches on some of the most fundamental questions about who we are as a nation and what values we hold dear.
So true. Now, before we delve further into the legal intricacies and potential consequences of the Alien Enemies Act, let's take a quick detour and see what everyday people are saying about all this. We've got some Reddit comments that really capture like the range of reactions.
Oh, Reddit. Always a fascinating window into the public consciousness.
Right. It's like getting a raw, unfiltered pulse of how people are feeling. And believe me, the reactions are pretty intense.
I can imagine. This is a law that, even in its dormancy, holds the potential to disrupt lives and shake the foundations of our society.
Yeah. It's a sobering reminder that history isn't just something we read about in textbooks. It can come roaring back to life in unexpected ways.
It can. And it's up to us, as informed citizens, to understand the past, engage with the present, and shape the future.
Well said. So let's dive into those Reddit comments and see what people are saying about the Alien Enemies Act. What are the fears, the hopes, the outrage? Stay tuned, because things are about to get real.
Buckle up.
All right, so we've laid out the historical context and some modern-day concerns surrounding the Alien Enemies Act. But let's face it, this stuff can get pretty heavy.
It can be a bit much.
Yeah. So to lighten the mood a little bit, we're going to dive into the wild world of Reddit. And we're going to see how people are reacting to this whole situation.
Always a good time. I'm fascinated by how Reddit can kind of provide, uh, a sort of real-time barometer of public sentiment.
It's like this digital town square where
Well,
people can just like vent their frustrations,
yeah.
share their anxieties, maybe even like, crack a few jokes along the way.
Right.
And trust me, there are some hilarious comments in here.
Well, humor can be a powerful coping mechanism, especially when dealing with, complex and potentially unsettling issues.
Absolutely. But before we get to the funny stuff, let's address the very real concerns that people are expressing. We're seeing a lot of comments that echo the Brennan Center's warnings.
Mm-hmm.
Folks are worried about potential abuse, about the act being used to target people who aren't even involved in criminal activity.
It's understandable that, people would draw parallels to historical examples like the Japanese internment.
Right.
This was a dark chapter in American history where the Alien Enemies Act was used to justify the mass incarceration of innocent people based solely on their ancestry.
It's a chilling reminder that even in a democracy, the line between security and individual rights can be pretty blurry.
It can be.
And sometimes those lines get crossed.
Yeah. And that's why, the role of the courts is so crucial. They serve as a check on executive power, ensuring that laws are interpreted and applied fairly and justly.
Okay. But the Brennan Center seems a little skeptical about whether the current Supreme Court would be up to that task.
Mm-hmm.
They suggest that the court might be more inclined to defer to the president, especially when it comes to matters of national security.
Well, it's a valid concern, and it reflects a broader anxiety, I think, about the balance of power in our government.
Yeah.
However, predicting how the Supreme Court might rule on any given case is a very tricky business.
Yeah.
There are so many factors involved, the composition of the court, the specific arguments presented, the political climate, even public opinion can play a role.
So we're left with a lot of what ifs.
Yeah.
A lot of uncertainty.
A lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty in itself can be unsettling. It underscores the need, I think, for informed civic engagement, for active participation in the debates that shape our laws and our society.
Yeah. It's like that old saying, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We can't just sit back and assume that our rights will always be protected.
No.
We have to be active participants in the process.
Absolutely. And that includes being aware of the potential for abuse, for overreach, for the erosion of our core values in the name of security.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the Alien Enemies Act.
Yeah.
How exactly could this law be abused? Like, what are the potential scenarios that people are worried about?
Well, one major concern is that, the Act's definition of enemy alien is quite broad.
Mm-hmm.
It could potentially be used to target anyone who is not a U.S. citizen, regardless of their actual ties to a hostile nation.
So in theory, someone who's been like living in the U.S. legally for years, paying taxes, contributing to the community, they could suddenly be considered an enemy alien.
That's the fear. And under the Act, the president has the power to apprehend and detain these individuals without a warrant or even a hearing.
That's pretty scary. It sounds like it could easily be used to like round up people based on their ethnicity, religion, or even political beliefs.
Those are valid concerns, especially when you consider how easily fear and prejudice can be exploited. Particularly in times of crisis or perceived threats.
It's like a slippery slope.
Yeah.
You start by targeting one group,
Mm-hmm.
and then it becomes easier to expand the scope,
Right.
to erode more and more rights in the name of security.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the historical precedents, to learn from the mistakes of the past. We've seen how the Alien Enemies Act can be used to justify injustice, to violate the very principles of due process and equal protection under the law.
And it seems like a lot of people on Reddit are picking up on these historical parallels.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing comments that express fear about the potential for mass detentions, about the possibility of another internment-like situation.
Mm-hmm. It's understandable that people would be worried.
Yeah.
given the echoes of the past. And this is where understanding the nuances of legal interpretation becomes crucial.
Okay.
The Act's language is quite specific. And there are legal scholars who argue that using it in the context of, modern day gang activity would be a stretch, a distortion of its original intent.
Okay, so break it down for us. Like, what are the potential legal roadblocks to using the Act in this way?
Well, for one, the Act refers specifically to individuals who are, natives, citizens, denizens, or subjects of a hostile nation. Attributing the actions of individuals, even those involved in organized crime, to the actions of their entire nation state is a legal leap, to say the least.
Especially when there's no declared war or invasion.
Exactly. The Brennan Center argues that, using the Alien Enemies Act in this way would be, twisting its purpose beyond recognition. They're essentially saying that it's a wartime statute, not a tool for domestic law enforcement.
And they seem pretty concerned about the potential consequences if this line is blurred.
Rightfully so. They point out that such a move could, set a dangerous precedent, eroding the very foundations of due process and fair treatment under the law.
And it seems like a lot of folks on Reddit share those worries. We're seeing comments expressing fear about potential abuse, about the Act being expanded to target people who aren't even involved in criminal activity.
It's understandable that people would draw parallels to the Japanese internment, a dark chapter in American history when the Alien Enemies Act was used to justify the mass incarceration of innocent people based solely on their ancestry.
Right. It's a sobering reminder that even in a democracy, the balance between security and individual rights can be fragile.
It can, precisely. And this is why the role of the courts is so vital. They serve as a check on executive power, ensuring that laws are interpreted and applied fairly and justly.
Okay, but the Brennan Center seems, a little skeptical about whether the current Supreme Court would be up to that task.
Yeah.
They suggest that the court might be more inclined to defer to the president, especially when it comes to matters of national security.
It's a legitimate concern, especially given, recent rulings that have expanded executive power in certain areas. However, it's important to remember that the judiciary is a complex and dynamic institution. Predicting how the court might rule on a hypothetical case is never a sure thing.
So we're left with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of, what ifs.
Indeed. And that uncertainty in itself is unsettling. It underscores the importance of, remaining vigilant, of actively engaging in these debates and holding our leaders accountable for upholding the principles of justice and the rule of law.
This is big picture stuff.
Yeah.
But I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
This isn't just about legal technicalities.
No.
It's about the kind of society we want to live in.
Exactly. Do we value, fairness, due process, and the protection of individual rights, even in the face of perceived threats? Or are we willing to sacrifice those values in the name of expediency and security?
Those are heavy questions.
They are.
But honestly, these are the conversations that we need to be having.
I completely agree. Informed citizens are the bedrock of a healthy democracy.
So true. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring in one last piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
Public opinion. It's clear that people are feeling a lot of different things about this issue, and those emotions can be powerful drivers of political action.
Oh, they can be. Emotions are often at the heart of our most profound beliefs and values. It's crucial to acknowledge and understand them even as we strive for reasoned discourse.
Okay, so let's go back to those Reddit comments for a minute. What are people saying, and how do those comments reflect the broader public conversation around immigration and national security?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, we see a wide spectrum of responses, fear, anger, humor, even outright denial. Some express deep concern about the potential for abuse, while others dismiss those concerns as overblown or even hysterical.
Yeah, it's a pretty divided landscape.
It is, which reflects, the broader societal divisions we're grappling with. Immigration has become a deeply polarizing issue, often framed in terms of us versus them.
And it seems like those divisions are only intensifying. We're seeing a rise in nationalist sentiment, a hardening of attitudes towards immigrants and a willingness to accept more authoritarian measures in the name of security.
It's a troubling trend, and one that echoes, historical patterns we've seen play out time and again. When societies feel threatened, whether by economic instability, social change, or perceived external enemies, there's often a tendency to retreat inward, to embrace, strongman leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems.
And those solutions often involve scapegoating and targeting marginalized groups.
Exactly, and that's where understanding history becomes so vital. We can learn from past mistakes, recognize the warning signs of authoritarianism, and resist the temptation to sacrifice our core values in the name of security.
So where do we go from here?
Right.
How do we navigate this complex landscape and ensure that our laws are applied justly and equitably?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
But I think the first step is to acknowledge the complexity of the issue, to recognize that there are no easy answers or quick fixes.
Right. It's not about demonizing one side or the other, but about having, honest, open conversations about the challenges we face and the values we hold dear.
Exactly. We need to engage with diverse perspectives, be willing to listen and learn from each other, and strive for solutions that uphold the principles of justice and fairness for all.
Easier said than done.
Absolutely. But the stakes are too high to shy away from these difficult conversations. The future of our democracy depends on our willingness to engage thoughtfully and courageously with the challenges of our time.
Well said. And, it strikes me that while we've been focusing on the Alien Enemies Act, this conversation is really about something much bigger.
It is.
It's about the kind of society we want to be, about the values we prioritize, and about the role of law in protecting those values.
You've hit the nail on the head. This deep dive has taken us into the heart of some profound questions about the nature of democracy, the balance of power, and the enduring tension between security and liberty.
And honestly, those questions are more relevant than...
They are, indeed. As we navigate an increasingly complex and interconnected world, we need to be mindful of the lessons of history, be willing to engage in nuanced debate, and hold fast to the principles of justice and the rule of law.
Well said. Now, listeners, we've thrown a lot of information at you.
We have.
But we don't want to leave you feeling overwhelmed. So instead of trying to cover every single Reddit comment,
Right.
let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture of what people are saying.
That's a good approach. It allows us to distill those raw, unfiltered opinions into some key themes and insights.
Exactly. So what are some of the recurring patterns you're seeing in the Reddit comments? What are the main points of concern, the areas of agreement, the points of contention?
Well, one thing that jumps out is a deep sense of anxiety, even fear about the potential for this law to be abused. Many commenters express concern that the Alien Enemies Act could be used to target individuals based on their ethnicity, their religion, or their political beliefs, rather than on any actual threat they pose.
Yeah, there's a definite sense of this could happen to me running through a lot of the comments.
There is. And it's not just abstract fear. Many people are drawing direct parallels to historical examples, like the Japanese internment, where the act was used to justify mass incarceration without due process. Those historical wounds are still raw for many, and they're fueling a lot of the anxiety that we're seeing online.
It's a stark reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It shapes our present and can cast a long shadow on the future.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding the historical context of the Alien Enemies Act is so crucial. It helps us see how the law has been used and potentially misused in the past. And it allows us to evaluate its potential implications in our own time.
So it's not just about the legal technicalities. It's about the broader societal and historical forces that shape our understanding of the law.
Right.
And its potential impact.
Exactly. And that's what makes this conversation so fascinating and so important.
Okay, so we've talked about the fear and the anxiety, but are there any other recurring themes you're noticing in the Reddit comments?
Yes, alongside the fear, there's also a lot of anger and frustration. Many commenters express outrage at the very idea of using a wartime law to address domestic issues, particularly when those issues involve, complex social problems like immigration.
That makes sense. It feels like a pretty drastic and disproportionate response.
It does, and some commenters are pointing out that this approach seems more focused on punishment and exclusion rather than on addressing the root causes of these complex social problems.
No, like they're saying, instead of like building walls and rounding people up, why not focus on creating more just and humane immigration policies?
Exactly, and that speaks to a deeper debate about the role of government, the balance between security and individual rights, and the values we prioritize as a society.
So even within the Reddit comments, we're seeing a microcosm of those larger societal debates playing out.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
It shows how even a seemingly obscure law like the Alien Enemies Act can touch on some of the most fundamental questions about who we are as a nation and what we stand for.
So true. Okay, so we've got fear, we've got anger.
Yeah.
But Reddit wouldn't be Reddit without a healthy dose of humor.
Right, of course not.
So what are some of the funnier reactions you've come across?
Oh, there are some gems in here. One commenter joked that the only enemy aliens they're worried about are the ones from those cheesy sci-fi movies. Another suggested that if we're going to round up dangerous immigrants, we should start with those pesky Canadians who keep, bringing down the price of healthcare.
Okay, that last one was pretty funny.
It is.
It's good to see that people haven't lost their sense of humor.
Yeah.
Even in the face of all this uncertainty and anxiety.
Well, humor can be a powerful tool for coping with difficult situations. It can help us process complex emotions, challenge authority, even find common ground.
So in a way, those jokes are more than just laughs.
They are.
They're a way of reclaiming agency.
Yeah.
Of finding some light in the darkness.
Exactly. And they remind us that even when things seem bleak, there's still room for hope, for resilience, for the human spirit to shine through.
Beautifully said. Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah.
but before we move on to the final part of this deep dive,
Okay.
I want to touch on one last aspect of the public reaction that I found particularly interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. What caught your attention?
Well, amidst all the fear, the anger, and the humor, there's also a strain of skepticism running through a lot of the Reddit comments. People are questioning whether all this talk about the Alien Enemies Act is just a distraction, a way of shifting focus away from other issues.
That's a perceptive observation. It speaks to, a broader sense of distrust in our institutions and a feeling that we're being manipulated by those in power.
Right. It's like people are saying, wait a minute, why are we suddenly so worried about this ancient law?
Mm-hmm.
Is this like a real threat, or is it just a smokescreen to cover up something else?
Yeah, it's a valid question. And it reflects, a healthy skepticism of authority. In a world where information is constantly bombarding us, it's important to be able to step back, critically evaluate what we're being told, and ask those tough questions.
So it's not just about accepting everything we hear at face value.
No.
It's about like digging deeper, questioning our assumptions, and forming our own informed opinions.
Exactly. And that's what we've been trying to do throughout this deep dive. We've examined the historical context of the Alien Enemies Act. We've analyzed its potential modern day implications, and we've explored the diverse range of public reactions. Now it's up to each of us to draw our own conclusions and decide what this all means for us as individuals and as a society.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect segue into the final part of this episode.
Okay.
We've laid out all the information, we've explored the different perspectives, and now it's time to kind of distill all of this into some key takeaways and offer some final thoughts for our listeners to ponder.
Sounds good to me. Let's wrap things up and leave our audience with someone to chew on.
Okay, so we've gone through, history, the law, all that stuff. We even took a look at what people are saying on Reddit. Now let's bring it all together. What are some of the key things we've learned about the Alien Enemies Act?
I think what really stands out to me is how a law from 1798 can still feel so relevant today. It just shows that history, it's not just, some dusty old thing in a textbook. It really shapes our present.
Yeah, for sure. So for our listeners who might be tuning in late or just need a recap, what are the main points we've covered?
Sure. Well, first off, the Alien Enemies Act it was meant for wartime,
Right.
but it's still part of U.S. law.
Wow. Oh,
Yeah, and the part about declared wars or invasions, that's led to a lot of debate about whether it could be used for things like gang violence or undocumented immigration.
which are obviously huge issues today.
Exactly. And then remember, former President Trump, he actually wanted to use it for deportations. Remember that?
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal.
Yeah, it was. And the Brennan Center, they really raised the alarm about that. They were like, hold on, this is a wartime law, not for everyday police work.
Right, and using it that way could really mess things up, legally speaking.
Right. And then, what about the courts? Could they actually stop the Alien Enemies Act from being used like that in peacetime?
It's a good question.
It is, and especially with the current Supreme Court, and how they view executive power, especially when it comes to national security, it's complicated.
Yeah, definitely.
It shows that, the law is always changing, and how it's been used before doesn't always mean it'll be used the same way again.
Right. And of course, we can't forget about what people are actually thinking about all of this. Remember those Reddit comments?
Oh, yeah. How could we forget?
I mean, there was a lot of passion there.
Mm-hmm.
Strong opinions about immigration and whether this law is even fair.
Mm-hmm. It really hits on something deep, doesn't it? How we see ourselves as a nation, who belongs, and, how far we should go to feel safe. It reminds us that laws aren't just words on paper. They reflect our values and history and, of course, politics.
Totally. So for our listeners who might be feeling a little lost with all this info, what are some key things you want them to take away from our deep dive?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember, don't just believe everything you hear, especially these days.
Right.
Be skeptical. Ask questions.
Think for yourself.
Exactly. Don't let your emotions make you accept or reject something without really thinking about it. Look at different sides, challenge your own views, and try to really understand the issues.
I like that. So in the end, this wasn't just about the Alien Enemies Act, right?
No, not really.
It was about something bigger, how history affects us now, the power of the government, and what it means to be a citizen in a democracy.
You got it. And that brings me to something we didn't really see in our sources, but that came up while we were talking. We focused on how this law could be used now, but what does it say about the whole idea of security versus individual rights, not just today, but throughout history? How has that balance changed over time and why?
That's a really great question for our listeners to think about. It shows that this law, it's not just some leftover from the past. It really reflects these deep anxieties and arguments that still shape our world.
Exactly. And in the end, protecting our values, our democracy, that's on all of us.
Well said. Thanks for being part of this deep dive, everyone. Hopefully you came away with some new insights, things to think about, and maybe even a desire to keep exploring the world around you. Until next time, keep learning.